The strongest people in the world are usually the ones who never feel the need to prove it. Blackwood State Prison was the kind of place where weakness was noticed before kindness and where respect was usually measured by the sound of the loudest voice. Every morning the steel doors opened at exactly 6 o'clock, and every morning the same groups gathered in the same corners of the yard. The younger inmates stayed together, the older ones kept their heads down, and everyone knew exactly who controlled each section of the block. Tyler Kane was one of those men. At 34 years old, broad-shouldered and full of confidence, he enjoyed making sure everyone around him understood where they stood. Most people avoided him because they knew arguing would only make life harder. On that particular morning, however, Tyler noticed someone new sitting alone near the edge of the recreation yard. The old prisoner had arrived only a few weeks earlier. His name was Samuel Brooks, and nobody seemed to know much about him. He was a black man in his early 60s with short gray hair, quiet eyes, and a calm expression that never seemed to change. He never joined arguments. He never tried to impress anyone. He simply walked to the library every morning, helped organize old books, and spent the rest of the day working wherever the prison staff needed an extra hand. Some inmates thought he had once been a teacher. Others guessed he had worked in construction because he always seemed to know how to fix broken shelves and loose tables. Samuel never corrected anyone. He simply smiled politely and continued with his day. Tyler looked across the yard and laughed. "Look at that old man," he said to the group standing beside him. "I have seen tougher people carrying groceries." Several inmates chuckled. One of them shrugged and said, "He keeps to himself." Tyler shook his head. People like that survive because everybody feels sorry for them. The old prisoner looked up when he heard the laughter. For a moment, the entire group expected some kind of reaction. Maybe anger, maybe embarrassment, maybe a complaint to the guards. Samuel simply looked at Tyler, gave him a small, respectful nod, and returned to reading the worn paperback resting in his hands. Tyler frowned. The reaction was not what he expected. "Did you hear me, old man?" he called out across the yard. Samuel slowly closed the book and stood up. He walked toward the water fountain with the same unhurried pace he had used every day since arriving at Blackwood. The closer he came, the quieter the conversation around Tyler became. There was nothing threatening about the older prisoner. He was not especially tall. He did not look powerful. His prison uniform hung loosely from his shoulders, and his hands showed the lines of many years of hard work. Yet there was something about the way he carried himself that made people watch without understanding why. Samuel filled a paper cup with water and took a slow drink. Tyler stepped closer. "You know what your problem is?" Samuel looked at him with complete calm. "No. What do you think it is?" Tyler smiled. "You look weak." A few inmates laughed again, but not as loudly as before. Samuel looked down at the paper cup in his hand before answering. "Sometimes people mistake quiet for weakness." Tyler folded his arms. "No, I think I know exactly what weakness looks like." Samuel nodded once, as though he had heard those words many times before. "Maybe one day you will discover that strength looks different than you expected." Without another word, he placed the empty cup into a nearby trash container and quietly walked toward the library building. Tyler watched him leave and laughed one more time, trying to pull the attention of everyone around him back to himself. "Did you hear that? The old man thinks he is teaching life lessons." A few people smiled, but several others simply looked toward the library door where Samuel had disappeared. Frank Dawson, one of the oldest inmates in the block and a former army mechanic, had watched the entire exchange from a bench near the fence. He slowly stood up and looked at Tyler. "Careful who you laugh at," Frank said quietly. Tyler smirked. "Why? You think he is somebody special?" Frank kept his eyes on the library entrance for another second before answering. "I think some men spend their whole lives learning not to show what they are capable of." Tyler shook his head and walked away, but for reasons he could not explain, the word stayed with him. Inside the library, Samuel Brooks placed his old paperback back onto the shelf, adjusted a crooked stack of books, and smiled softly to himself while the noise from the prison yard slowly faded into silence. The next morning arrived exactly like the one before, with the sound of metal doors opening and the low voices of inmates filling the corridors of Blackwood State Prison. Samuel Brooks walked through the yard carrying a small stack of worn library books against his chest. He moved with the same quiet pace that had already become familiar to the people around him. He greeted the kitchen workers with a polite nod. thanked one of the officers for holding a door open, and disappeared into the old library before most of the prison had even finished breakfast. The library sat in one of the oldest buildings inside Blackwood. Dust covered the highest shelves, several tables had uneven legs, and many of the books looked as though they had not been touched in years. Mrs. Eleanor Brooks, the elderly librarian who shared the same last name but no relation to Samuel, looked up from her desk when he entered. "You are early again," she said with a smile. Samuel placed the books on the counter. "The mornings are quiet. It is a good time to work." Mrs. Brooks laughed softly. "I think you have organized half this room already." Samuel looked around at the shelves. A library should feel welcoming. Without another word, he picked up a cloth and began cleaning the windows. Sunlight slowly reached across the room as the dust disappeared from the glass. A few minutes later, a younger inmate named Daniel Price walked inside carrying another box of returned books. Daniel was in his late 20s and had been assigned to help around the library because of good behavior. He watched Samuel for a moment before setting the box down. "You really like doing this?" Samuel smiled. "I like places where people can think." Daniel shrugged. "Nobody around here likes reading." Samuel reached into the box and picked up an old novel with a torn cover. "Sometimes people only need the right story." Daniel laughed a little. "You sound like a teacher." Samuel carefully placed the book onto the shelf. Life teaches everyone eventually. Outside in the recreation yard, Tyler Kane sat with the same group of inmates from the day before. One of them pointed toward the library building. "There goes your old man again." Tyler looked over and shook his head. "I still do not understand him." Another inmate grinned. "Maybe he is exactly what he looks like." Tyler folded his arms. "Nobody stays that calm in a place like this unless something is wrong with them." Across the yard, Frank Dawson happened to overhear the conversation while sweeping the walkway. He slowly looked toward the library windows where Samuel could be seen arranging books on a shelf. Frank had spent 20 years working as an army mechanic before life took him down a different road. He had met officers, instructors, and veterans from every kind of background, and there was something about Samuel that refused to fit the picture of an ordinary old prisoner. Later that afternoon, Mrs. Brooks asked Samuel and Daniel to organize a storage closet behind the library. Old boxes filled with magazines, broken lamps, and forgotten paperwork had collected there for years. Daniel opened the door and immediately coughed from the dust. "This place is a disaster." Samuel smiled gently. "Most things can be fixed if someone takes the time." They spent the next hour sorting through old books and stacking supplies into neat rows. Daniel noticed that Samuel never seemed rushed. He lifted heavy boxes carefully, wasted almost no movement, and always seemed to know the easiest way to solve a problem. At one point, Daniel reached for a loose stack of books sitting near the edge of a shelf. Before he touched them, Samuel quietly said, "Take the bottom one first." Daniel looked confused but followed the advice. The entire stack settled safely instead of falling. Daniel stared at him. "How did you know that would happen?" Samuel simply smiled. "You learn to notice small things." Daniel nodded slowly. "You really were a teacher, were you not?" Samuel looked down at the old books resting in his hands. "No," he answered softly. "I just spent a long time helping people learn." That answer stayed in Daniel's mind for the rest of the afternoon. When the work was finally finished, the storage room looked completely different. Mrs. Brooks stood in the doorway with surprise on her face. "I have been trying to clean this place for 5 years." Samuel handed her the final box. Sometimes all it takes is starting. As the evening count approached, Daniel and Samuel stepped outside the library together. Tyler happened to be walking across the yard with his friends. He glanced toward the old prisoner and smirked. "Still hiding behind books?" Samuel looked at him with the same calm expression he always carried. "Everyone hides behind something." Tyler laughed as he walked away, but Frank Dawson watched the exchange from across the yard, and for reasons he could not explain, he had the feeling that the quiet old man inside the library was carrying a story that nobody else had even begun to understand. The old library slowly became one of the few places inside Blackwood State Prison where time seemed to move differently. While the rest of the prison echoed with loud conversations and restless footsteps, the quiet room filled with shelves and dusty windows carried a strange sense of peace. Every morning Samuel Brooks unlocked the supply cabinet for Mrs. Eleanor Brooks, wiped down the reading tables, and arranged the returned books before anyone else arrived. He never rushed. He never complained. Even the oldest clock hanging above the front desk seemed to follow his steady rhythm. Daniel Price had started showing up earlier than he needed to. At first, he told himself it was simply easier to finish the work before lunch, but the truth was that he enjoyed listening to the older inmates speak. Samuel never gave speeches, yet somehow every simple sentence sounded important. That morning, Daniel carried a box of old magazines toward the back storage room. "Mrs. Brooks found another stack," he said with a smile. Samuel looked at the box and nodded. "Then we should find them a proper place." They walked together through the narrow hallway behind the library. The storage room had changed completely since Samuel arrived. Shelves stood straight, boxes were labeled, and old furniture had been stacked neatly against the walls. Daniel looked around and laughed. "I still cannot believe this is the same room." Samuel rested the magazines on a shelf. "People take better care of places that matter to them." Daniel looked at the old inmate for a second. "Did you always think like that?" Samuel paused before answering. "Someone once taught me that order helps people find peace." Daniel smiled. "Who was it?" Samuel looked toward the small window near the ceiling where sunlight was beginning to shine through the dust. "A good man." Before Daniel could ask another question, Mrs. Brooks called for help from the front of the library. A large delivery of donated books had arrived earlier than expected. Samuel and Daniel carried the empty carts outside. Several cardboard boxes sat near the entrance waiting to be moved. At the same moment, Tyler Kane happened to be walking across the yard with two other inmates. He stopped when he saw Samuel lifting one of the larger boxes. "Careful," Tyler called out with a grin. "That thing might be too heavy for you." His friends laughed. Samuel looked over and simply smiled. "Thank you for the concern." Tyler shook his head. "You really do not know when someone is making fun of you, do you?" Samuel calmly placed the box onto the cart without answering. Frank Dawson had been sweeping leaves near the walkway and watched the entire exchange. The older veteran narrowed his eyes slightly. There was something unusual about the way Samuel handled the heavy boxes. He did not struggle. He did not show off either. Every movement looked controlled and efficient, almost as though he had repeated the same motion thousands of times before. The work continued through the afternoon. Daniel climbed onto a small step ladder to place a stack of books onto the highest shelf. As he reached forward, one of the old wooden boards shifted slightly beneath his foot. The ladder leaned just enough to throw him off balance. Before anyone else reacted, Samuel quietly stepped forward and placed one hand against the side of the ladder. "Take your time," he said. Daniel steadied himself and slowly climbed back down. The entire moment lasted only a few seconds. Mrs. Brooks let out a relieved breath. "Thank goodness you were standing there." Daniel looked at Samuel with surprise. "How did you get there so fast?" Samuel simply adjusted the ladder until it stood evenly on the floor. "I saw the board move." Daniel looked down. The movement had been so small that he had not noticed it himself. Frank had noticed it too, but by the time he reached the shelf, Samuel had already solved the problem. The older veteran folded his arms and quietly studied the old prisoner. Most people would have looked at the ladder. Samuel had somehow noticed the floor beneath it. As evening approached, the donated books had all been sorted and placed onto the shelves. Mrs. Brooks thanked both men for their hard work before locking the front desk. Daniel walked toward the housing block beside Samuel. "You really do notice everything, do not you?" Samuel looked out across the quiet yard where the last sunlight touched the prison walls. "Small things usually tell the biggest stories." Daniel smiled, but Frank Dawson, who had been walking several steps behind them, felt those words settle deeply in his mind. He had spent enough years around disciplined men to recognize careful observation when he saw it. And for the first time since Samuel Brooks arrived at Blackwood, Frank began to wonder if the quiet old prisoner had once lived a life far different from the one anyone could see. I have prepared part 4 following the established continuity, pacing, and formatting requirements. The quiet routine inside Blackwood State Prison continued as though nothing unusual had happened, but Frank Dawson could not stop thinking about the moment in the library. The shifting ladder, the nearly invisible movement of the floorboard, and the way Samuel Brooks had calmly solved the problem before anyone else even understood it was happening stayed in his mind. Frank had spent years working around disciplined people, and experience had taught him that careful observation was rarely an accident. The next morning, Samuel arrived at the library before sunrise as he always did. Mrs. Eleanor Brooks was already there unlocking the front doors. She smiled when she saw him carrying a small toolbox in one hand and several old books in the other. "Another repair project?" she asked. Samuel looked toward one of the reading tables. "One of the legs is loose." Mrs. Brooks laughed softly. "I did not even notice." Samuel placed the books on the counter. Most people do not look at the small things. Daniel Price arrived a few minutes later and found Samuel kneeling beside the table, carefully adjusting the wooden support underneath. "You really can fix anything," Daniel said. Samuel stood up and gently pushed the table into place. It no longer moved. "Not everything," he answered. "Just enough to make life a little easier." Daniel smiled. "You always have an answer." Samuel looked around the library. Books have many answers. People simply forget to listen. Outside in the yard, Tyler Kane sat with the same small group of inmates. One of them pointed toward the library window where Samuel could be seen arranging books. "He is in there again." Tyler looked over and shook his head. "I still do not understand why everyone likes that old man." Another inmate shrugged. "Maybe because he stays out of trouble." Tyler stood up. "No. People respect him, and I want to know why." He started walking toward the library entrance. Frank Dawson happened to be sweeping nearby and quietly watched him go. Inside the library, Daniel was helping Mrs. Brooks unpack another box of donated books while Samuel worked near the back shelves. Tyler stepped through the front door and looked around with a smile that made the room suddenly feel smaller. "Never thought I would see prison turn into a bookstore," he joked. Mrs. Brooks adjusted her glasses. "Can I help you?" Tyler ignored the question and looked directly at Samuel. "You spend a lot of time hiding in here." Samuel calmly placed another book onto the shelf before turning around. "I enjoy quiet places." Tyler folded his arms. "Or maybe you just like staying away from people who would remind you that you are weak." Daniel stopped unpacking books. Mrs. Brooks looked uncomfortable. Samuel simply met Tyler's eyes with the same calm expression he always carried. "Everyone has their own idea of strength." Tyler laughed. "Mine is simple. Strong people do not hide." Samuel nodded once. "Sometimes the strongest people are the ones who no longer need attention." The room fell silent for a moment. Tyler looked as though he wanted another answer, but none came. Samuel simply returned to his work. Frustrated, Tyler shook his head and walked back toward the door. As he passed Frank Dawson outside, he laughed loudly enough for everyone nearby to hear. "That old man talks like he knows everything." Frank rested his broom against the wall and quietly looked toward the library window. "Maybe he knows more than you think." Tyler smirked. "You believe that too?" Frank did not answer immediately. His eyes stayed fixed on Samuel, who was helping Daniel place books onto the shelves. Every movement looked controlled. Every step looked balanced. "I have met men like him before," Frank finally said. Tyler laughed. "An old librarian?" Frank slowly shook his head. "No. Men who spent their lives carrying responsibility without talking about it." Tyler rolled his eyes and walked away. Later that afternoon, Mrs. Brooks asked Samuel and Daniel to move several old boxes from a storage closet into the library. While Daniel the old library at Blackwood State Prison slowly became more than just a room filled with dusty shelves and forgotten books. It became a place where people lowered their voices without being asked, and where even the hardest inmates seemed willing to sit quietly for a few minutes. Mrs. Eleanor Brooks often smiled when she watched the change happen. She had worked there for almost 15 years and had never seen so many people walk through the front door simply because they wanted to. Samuel Brooks never acted as though he had done anything special. Every morning, he opened the windows, straightened the chairs, and carefully returned each book to its proper place. Daniel Price had started bringing a small notebook with him. Whenever Samuel said something that sounded important, Daniel quietly wrote it down. That morning, while they were organizing another shipment of donated books, Daniel looked up and asked, "How do you always know what to say?" Samuel placed a history book onto the shelf and smiled. "Most people already know the answer. They just need someone to remind them." Daniel wrote the sentence into his notebook. Mrs. Brooks laughed softly from behind her desk. "At this rate, you are going to fill an entire journal." Daniel shrugged. "I think it is worth remembering." Outside the library, Tyler Kane noticed more inmates walking toward the building than usual. He frowned as Marcus Hill, a quiet younger prisoner who rarely talked to anyone, stepped inside carrying a worn paperback. Tyler called after him. "Since when do you read books?" Marcus looked back and smiled. "Since somebody showed me one that was worth opening." Tyler watched him disappear through the door and shook his head. He could not understand why people seemed drawn toward the old prisoner. Later that afternoon, Mrs. Brooks asked Samuel and Daniel to help clean another storage cabinet that had not been opened for years. The old metal doors creaked loudly as Daniel pulled them open. Dust covered several shelves filled with boxes, framed certificates, and stacks of old newspapers. "Looks like nobody has touched this place forever," Daniel said. Samuel picked up one of the boxes and gently brushed away the dust. Old things deserve a second look. They carried several boxes into the library and started sorting through them. Most contained old reading program records and outdated magazines. Then Daniel opened a smaller package tied with faded string. Inside were several black and white newspaper clippings. "These might be interesting," he said. Mrs. Brooks looked over from her desk. "I forgot those were even here." Daniel unfolded the first page carefully. Most of the article had faded, but a large photograph remained visible. It showed a group of military instructors standing together beside a training field. The image was old and slightly damaged around the edges. Samuel happened to glance toward the table for just a moment before returning to his work. Frank Dawson walked into the library carrying a cart of supplies and noticed the photograph immediately. His eyes narrowed slightly. "Where did you find that?" Daniel held it up. "In the old cabinet." Frank stepped closer and studied the picture. The uniforms looked familiar. The posture of the men standing together reminded him of people he had known years ago. Several faces had been damaged by time, making them difficult to recognize. Samuel quietly carried another box toward the back shelves without saying a word. Daniel looked at Frank. "Do you know who they are?" Frank slowly shook his head. "Not exactly." Mrs. Brooks smiled. "Most of those papers came from donations a long time ago." Frank continued looking at the faded image. Something about it felt strangely familiar, but he could not explain why. Before he could study it any longer, Tyler Kane stepped into the library. He looked around at the old newspapers spread across the table and laughed. "What is this now?" "History class." Daniel folded the clipping and placed it back into the box. "Just cleaning storage." Tyler looked toward Samuel. "I guess old people like old stories." Samuel calmly placed another book onto the shelf. "Every story matters to someone." Tyler rolled his eyes. "Not all of them." Samuel looked at the dusty box for a brief moment. "Sometimes the ones people forget are the most important." The room grew quiet again. Tyler shook his head and walked back outside, but Frank never took his eyes off the old newspaper. As evening approached, the boxes were returned to the storage room, and the faded photograph disappeared back into the cabinet. Samuel closed the metal doors and gently turned the key. Daniel looked at him curiously. "Do you think those old stories are really important?" Samuel rested his hand against the cabinet for a second before answering. "The past has a way of finding people when the time is right." Frank stood a few feet away listening to every word. As they walked back toward the housing block that evening, he found himself thinking less about the damaged newspaper and more about the quiet old prisoner who never seemed surprised by anything. And for the first time, he wondered if the forgotten photograph and Samuel Brooks might somehow belong to the very same story. As the days passed, the library at Blackwood State Prison became one of the busiest places inside the entire facility. It was not because of the books alone. People came because the room felt different. The arguments that usually followed inmates into every corner of the prison somehow stopped at the library door. Mrs. Eleanor Brooks often joked that the old building had finally learned how to breathe again, but Daniel Price knew the real reason. Ever since Samuel Brooks arrived, the place had slowly changed. Samuel never gave orders and never asked anyone to act differently. He simply treated every person with the same quiet respect, whether they were an officer, an inmate, or someone who had never opened a book in their life. One afternoon, Daniel noticed Marcus Hill sitting alone at one of the reading tables. Only a month earlier, Marcus rarely spoke to anyone. Now he spent nearly an hour every day with a novel in front of him. Daniel walked over and smiled. "I never thought I would see you reading." Marcus looked up. "Neither did I." Daniel nodded towards Samuel, who was quietly repairing the binding on an old history book near the window. "Was it him?" Marcus smiled. "He told me every man deserves one place where his mind can be free." Daniel looked across the room. Samuel had not heard the conversation, or at least he pretended not to. He simply continued working with the same calm expression he always carried. Later that day, Mrs. Brooks asked Samuel and Daniel to reorganize a section of shelves that had become overcrowded. While they worked, Daniel finally asked the question that had been sitting in his mind for weeks. When you said you spent a long time helping people learn, what did you mean? Samuel carefully moved several books into a new row before answering. People do not always learn from classrooms. Daniel waited for more, but Samuel simply smiled and continued arranging the shelves. Daniel laughed quietly. You always answer without really answering. Samuel looked at him kindly. Some stories belong to the past until the right moment arrives. Outside, Tyler Kane noticed another group of inmates walking toward the library. He watched Marcus, Frank Dawson, and two younger prisoners disappear through the front door. What is so special about that place? He muttered. One of his friends shrugged. People say the old man gives good advice. Tyler shook his head. Advice does not change people. Frank happened to be standing just inside the doorway and heard the words. He looked back toward Tyler and answered calmly. Sometimes one conversation can change an entire life. Tyler rolled his eyes and walked away, but his expression showed something different than before. It was no longer simple amusement. It was curiosity. Inside the library, Frank slowly walked toward Samuel. The old newspaper clipping from the storage room had stayed in his thoughts ever since he saw it. Can I ask you something? Frank said quietly. Samuel closed the book he had been repairing. Of course. Frank hesitated for a moment. Have you ever served in the military? Daniel looked up from the shelf he was organizing. Mrs. Brooks paused at her desk. Samuel rested his hands gently on the table and looked toward the window. A long time ago, I spent some years around people who wore uniforms. Frank studied his face carefully. That is all you are going to say? Samuel smiled. It is enough for today. Frank nodded slowly. He understood what silence looked like when someone carried old memories. He had seen it before. As the afternoon passed, the library continued filling with people. Some came for books. Some came simply to sit quietly for a while. One young inmate asked Samuel how to write a letter to his daughter because he had not spoken to her in years. Samuel helped him choose the words, but never looked at the paper itself. The important things should come from your own heart, he said. Mrs. Brooks watched the moment with tears in her eyes. You know, she said softly after the young man left, I think this library has helped more people in the last month than it has in the last 10 years. Samuel looked around the room at the shelves, the tables, and the quiet conversations happening all around him. People usually know the right path, he answered. Sometimes they only need a place quiet enough to hear themselves. As evening count approached, the library slowly emptied. Daniel locked the storage cabinet, while Mrs. Brooks turned off the lights one by one. Frank stood near the doorway and looked back at Samuel. The old prisoner was placing the final book onto a shelf with the same careful movement he used every day. Frank had known many men who demanded respect. Samuel never asked for it, yet somehow the entire room offered it freely. Walking back across the yard, Frank looked toward the fading sunset above the prison walls and quietly admitted something to himself that he had been resisting for days. Whatever Samuel Brooks had been before arriving at Blackwood, it was something extraordinary, and somehow that forgotten old newspaper clipping was beginning to feel less like an accident and more like the first piece of a much larger story. By the beginning of the next week, people inside Blackwood State Prison had started talking about the library in a way they never had before. It was no longer just a room where old books gathered dust. It had become a place where arguments seemed to fade and where men who usually trusted nobody found themselves sitting quietly for a few minutes at a time. Samuel Brooks never asked for attention, yet somehow the change around him continued to grow. Mrs. Eleanor Brooks often smiled as she watched inmates carefully return books to the shelves instead of leaving them scattered across the tables. Daniel Price noticed it too. You know, he said one afternoon while organizing a stack of biographies, I think people come here just to talk to you. Samuel looked at the book in his hands and smiled gently. Maybe they come because they finally have a place where someone listens. Daniel laughed quietly. You always make simple things sound important. Samuel placed the final book onto the shelf. Simple things usually are. Across the yard, Tyler Kane sat on a bench watching another small group of inmates walk toward the library. Marcus Hill carried a novel under one arm. Frank Dawson followed behind him, and even two younger inmates who rarely left their own section of the block headed in the same direction. Tyler frowned. I do not get it, he muttered. One of his friends looked toward the library windows. Maybe the old guy knows something. Tyler stood up. Everybody keeps saying that. His friend shrugged. Even Frank respects him. That answer bothered Tyler more than he wanted to admit. Frank Dawson was not the kind of man who admired people easily. Tyler had known him for years and had never once seen him impressed by anyone inside Blackwood. Yet lately Frank seemed to watch Samuel with quiet interest, almost like he was trying to remember something. That afternoon, Tyler finally walked toward the library alone. He stopped just outside the doorway and looked through the window. Samuel was helping Daniel repair the cover of an old dictionary. Mrs. Brooks sat behind her desk reading paperwork, while Marcus quietly turned the pages of a history book. Nobody noticed Tyler standing there. For several seconds, he simply watched. Samuel moved carefully, saying very little, but everyone around him seemed comfortable. Tyler could not explain why that bothered him. He finally pushed the door open and stepped inside. Daniel looked up first. "Need a book?" Tyler smiled slightly. "I do not think so." Samuel raised his eyes from the dictionary. "Then perhaps you need a quiet place." Tyler folded his arms. "I want to understand something." Samuel waited patiently. "Why does everybody around here act like you are special?" The library became completely silent. Mrs. Brooks lowered her glasses. Marcus stopped reading. Daniel looked from Tyler to Samuel, waiting for the answer. Samuel closed the dictionary and gently placed it on the table. "I am not special." Tyler shook his head. "Then why do people listen to you?" Samuel thought for a moment before speaking. "Because I listen to them first." Tyler frowned. The answer was so simple that it almost felt disappointing. "That cannot be all." Samuel smiled kindly. "Most people spend their lives waiting for someone to hear them." Tyler stood there for another second before turning around and walking back outside. He had expected a story, a secret, or at least some kind of explanation. Instead, he carried away another quiet sentence that refused to leave his mind. Frank Dawson had been sweeping near the front entrance and saw Tyler leave. "Did you find what you were looking for?" he asked. Tyler looked back toward the library. "No," Frank nodded. "Neither have I." As the evening approached, Daniel helped Samuel return several books to the highest shelf in the room. While moving a large encyclopedia, something slipped from between the pages and landed softly on the table. Daniel picked it up. It was an old bookmark, faded with age. On one side was a simple drawing of an eagle. On the other side were a few worn words that were almost impossible to read. Daniel looked closer. "It says, 'Strength serves others.'" Samuel quietly reached out and took the bookmark. For the first time since Daniel had met him, the old prisoner remained silent for several seconds. He looked at the small piece of paper as though it belonged to another lifetime. Then he smiled gently and slipped it back inside the book. "That is a lesson worth remembering." Frank happened to see the exchange through the window from outside. He could not explain why, but the image of the eagle stirred an old memory buried deep inside his mind. He stood perfectly still, watching Samuel place the encyclopedia back onto the shelf, and a single thought slowly began to form. Somewhere in the forgotten years before Blackwood, the quiet old prisoner had belonged to a world built on discipline, service, and responsibility, and Frank was beginning to believe that the answers everyone was searching for had been hiding in plain sight all along. The small eagle printed on the old bookmark stayed in Frank Dawson's mind long after the library closed for the evening. He had seen symbols like that years before, back when he worked around military bases repairing heavy equipment. The image itself was simple, but the words written beneath it were what troubled him most. "Strength serves others." It was not the kind of phrase people invented for decoration. It sounded like something that belonged to a lesson, a tradition, or a code that had guided someone for a very long time. The next morning, Frank arrived at the library earlier than usual. Mrs. Eleanor Brooks was still unlocking the front door when she saw him waiting outside. "You are here before Samuel today," she said with a smile. Frank nodded. "I was hoping to ask you something." She opened the door and stepped inside. "If it is about books, I will try my best." Frank looked toward the old storage room at the back of the library. "Those newspaper clippings we found a few days ago. Do you remember where they came from?" Mrs. Brooks thought for a moment. "Most of them were donated years ago when an old community center closed. I never had time to sort everything." Frank nodded quietly. "Do you think they are still back there?" Before she could answer, Samuel Brooks walked through the front entrance carrying his usual stack of returned books. He greeted them with a polite smile and began arranging the shelves without asking what they were discussing. Frank noticed that Samuel never seemed interested in explaining his own past. In fact, he almost looked more comfortable talking about other people than himself. A little later that morning, Mrs. Brooks handed Frank the key to the storage cabinet. "If you want to look through the old boxes, be my guest." Daniel Price joined him a few minutes later. Together, they carried several dusty containers into the reading room and carefully opened them one by one. Most held old magazines, damaged paperbacks, and outdated prison records. Then Daniel found the same box they had opened before. "Here it is," he said. Frank carefully unfolded the old newspaper clipping and placed it flat on the table. The picture was still faded, but the sunlight coming through the library windows made a few more details visible. Several men stood together in matching uniforms beside a training field. Their faces remained difficult to recognize, but one figure near the center seemed strangely familiar. Daniel leaned closer. "Do you think that could be him?" Frank looked across the room toward Samuel, who was helping Marcus Hill repair a loose bookshelf. The old prisoner laughed quietly at something Marcus said, then returned to work as though he had not noticed the conversation. Frank looked back at the photograph. "I do not know." Daniel turned the newspaper over. On the back was a small article, but most of the words had faded with time. Only a few lines could still be read. "Community honors local Marine training team for years of service." Daniel pointed at the headline. "Marine." Frank slowly lowered his hand. The memory that had been sitting just beyond his reach finally began to take shape. Years ago, he had worked near a military training facility where instructors were respected almost like legends. They were known for discipline, patience, and teaching others to stay calm under pressure. Frank looked back toward Samuel again. The careful movements, the quiet confidence, the way he noticed the smallest details before anyone else. Suddenly those things no longer felt like coincidences. At that moment, Samuel walked over carrying a stack of books. He noticed the old newspaper on the table, but showed no surprise. "Finding anything interesting?" he asked. Daniel smiled. "It says these men help train Marines." Samuel looked at the faded picture for only a second. "That was a long time ago." Frank watched him closely. "Have you ever known anyone like that?" Samuel rested the books on the table and gently straightened the corner of the newspaper that had folded over. "I knew people who believed that strength was meant to protect others." Daniel looked at the old bookmark lying beside the clipping. "Just like the words on this." Samuel smiled softly. "Good lessons have a way of lasting." Before anyone could ask another question, Mrs. Brooks called for help moving a cart of donated books. Samuel quietly picked up the stack in front of him and walked away. Frank stared after him. Daniel broke the silence first. "You think he was one of them, do not you?" Frank looked down at the old photograph one more time. The faded face in the center of the group was still impossible to identify with certainty, but deep inside, he already knew the answer. The quiet old prisoner who spent his days fixing shelves and helping strangers write letters had once belonged to a world built on discipline and service, and for the first time Frank realized that Samuel Brooks was not hiding because he was afraid of being noticed. He was hiding because he had already spent a lifetime carrying responsibilities that most people would never understand. After the discovery of the old newspaper clipping, Frank Dawson found it harder and harder to think about anything else. Every detail seemed to point toward the same conclusion, yet he still could not prove it. The faded photograph, the words written on the old bookmark, and the quiet confidence Samuel Brooks carried every day all seemed connected. Frank had spent enough years around military people to know that discipline never truly disappeared. It stayed with a person long after the uniform was gone. The next morning he arrived at the library carrying a small cardboard box that had been sitting under his bunk for years. Daniel Price noticed it immediately. "What is that?" Frank placed it carefully on one of the reading tables. "Old memories." Mrs. Eleanor Brooks looked over her glasses with curiosity. Samuel was standing near the front shelves arranging returned books, but he said nothing. Frank slowly opened the box. Inside were several faded photographs, a few service manuals, and an old notebook filled with handwritten names and dates. Daniel picked up one of the pictures. It showed a younger Frank standing beside a group of military mechanics many years ago. "You kept all this?" Daniel asked. Frank nodded. "Some things remind you where you came from." He turned the pages of the notebook until he reached a section covered with old unit references and training locations. Many of the names meant nothing to Daniel, but one line made Frank stop completely. "Marine Advanced Training Program." He stared at the words for several seconds. Samuel quietly walked past the table carrying another stack of books. His eyes briefly touched the page before moving on without a single change in expression. Daniel looked at Frank. What is it? Frank reached into the newspaper box they had found earlier and laid the faded photograph beside his notebook. He compared the training field in the article with an old map sketched into the margin of his journal. His breathing slowed. I remember this place. Daniel leaned closer. You have been there? Frank nodded. Not for training. I repaired equipment nearby. Mrs. Brooks quietly stood up from her desk and joined them. Does that help? Frank looked back and forth between the newspaper and his notebook. Those instructors had a reputation. People used to talk about them like they could solve any problem without raising their voices. Daniel glanced towards Samuel again. The old prisoner was helping Marcus Hill repair another damaged bookshelf with the same patient care he showed every day. Frank slowly closed the notebook. One of them was famous for saying that real strength was measured by how many people you lifted up. Daniel looked surprised. That sounds exactly like Samuel. At that moment, Marcus accidentally dropped a small box of library cards onto the floor. Hundreds of cards scattered across the room. Daniel immediately bent down to help gather them, but before he could reach the nearest stack, Samuel quietly said, "Keep the numbers together first. The letters can wait." Everyone paused for a second. Daniel looked down and realized that the cards had fallen into separate sections. By following Samuel's advice, they could reorganize everything in only a few minutes instead of an hour. Marcus smiled. How do you always know the easiest way? Samuel gently picked up the first stack. Complicated problems usually have simple answers. Frank watched him carefully. The sentence sounded strangely familiar. He opened his old notebook one last time and flipped through the pages until he found a folded sheet tucked inside the back cover. It was an old training handout he had been given decades earlier while working near the base. Across the top, in faded letters, were the words "leadership through calm action." Beneath the title was a single quote. Complicated problems usually have simple answers if people stay calm enough to see them. Frank lowered the page slowly. Daniel noticed the look on his face. What is wrong? Frank looked across the room at Samuel Brooks. The old prisoner was placing the final library card back into its proper drawer as though nothing unusual had happened. Frank could hardly believe what he was seeing. He had not remembered the quote until that exact moment, but now he knew where he had heard it before. Mrs. Brooks quietly looked at the old paper in his hands. Do you recognize it? Frank nodded very slowly. I do. Daniel waited for him to continue. Frank looked towards Samuel one more time before speaking. Years ago, there was an instructor people talked about all over that base. They said he never raised his voice and never asked anyone to do something he would not do himself. Daniel's eyes widened. You think that was him? Frank folded the old paper carefully and slipped it back into the notebook. I do not think anymore. He looked through the library window where the afternoon sunlight rested across Samuel's shoulders as he quietly returned another book to its shelf. I believe the man everyone here calls an ordinary old prisoner spent his life teaching others what real strength looks like, and somehow he has never stopped. I have prepared Part 10 following the established continuity, pacing, and formatting requirements. The quiet discovery Frank Dawson had carried for days never became a loud announcement. He never walked into the prison yard and told everyone what he believed about Samuel Brooks. Somehow the truth spread in a different way. It moved through small conversations, quiet observations, and the simple fact that more and more people had begun to notice the old prisoner was unlike anyone else inside Blackwood State Prison. Daniel Price was the first to speak about it without really meaning to. While helping another inmate find a history book, he smiled and said, Samuel always knows the answer. The younger inmate laughed. Maybe he was a teacher. Daniel thought about the old newspaper clipping and the faded military photograph. Maybe he taught something bigger than books. The conversation lasted only a few seconds, but by lunchtime, 3 other inmates had heard it. By the end of the afternoon, people around the housing block were quietly wondering who Samuel Brooks had been before he arrived at Blackwood. Samuel himself seemed completely unaware of the attention. He opened the library that morning just as he always did, straightened the reading tables, watered the small plant Mrs. Eleanor Brooks kept beside the window, and carefully repaired the corner of an old encyclopedia that had started to come apart. Marcus Hill walked inside carrying a letter. Could you read this? He asked softly. My daughter sent it yesterday. Samuel smiled and motioned toward one of the tables. He listened while Marcus slowly read the words aloud himself, stopping only when emotion made the sentences difficult to finish. When the letter was over, Samuel simply nodded. She sounds proud of you. Marcus lowered the paper. I do not think I deserve that. Samuel folded his hands together. Sometimes the people who love us see the best parts before we do. Daniel, who had been organizing shelves nearby, quietly wrote the sentence into his notebook. Outside the library, Tyler Kane noticed another small line of inmates waiting to enter. He watched Marcus leave with a smile on his face and looked confused. One of his friends leaned against the wall beside him. You know, maybe that old guy really is somebody. Tyler crossed his arms. Everybody keeps saying that. His friend shrugged. Frank believes it. Tyler looked across the yard toward Frank Dawson, who was carrying a cart of maintenance supplies. Frank caught his eye and gave a small nod before continuing on his way. Tyler had never seen Frank show that kind of respect toward anyone inside the prison. The thought stayed with him longer than he expected. Later that afternoon, Mrs. Brooks asked Samuel to help rearrange a display of donated books near the front entrance. As they worked, an officer walked into the library carrying a package that had arrived from storage. Found this while cleaning out an old office, he said. Thought you might want it for the shelves. Inside the package was a simple wooden frame containing a faded quote printed on yellowed paper. Mrs. Brooks wiped away the dust and read the words aloud. The strongest leader is the one who helps others become strong. Daniel smiled immediately. That sounds exactly like Samuel. Mrs. Brooks laughed. It really does. Samuel looked at the frame for a moment before gently taking it in his hands. He ran his fingers across the worn wood and quietly hung it on the wall above the reading tables. It belongs here, he said. Tyler happened to be standing outside the open doorway when he heard those words. He looked up at the framed message and then back at Samuel. For the first time since the old prisoner arrived at Blackwood, Tyler did not see someone weak. He saw a man who somehow carried himself with the same quiet confidence every day without ever asking anyone to notice. As evening approached, Frank Dawson found Daniel placing books back onto the shelves. How many people have asked about Samuel today? Frank asked. Danny. The quiet changes inside Blackwood State Prison had become impossible for anyone to ignore. The library was no longer simply a place where books were stored. It had become the heart of the entire block, and almost everyone understood that Samuel Brooks was the reason. Yet Samuel himself acted exactly as he had on the first day he arrived. Every morning, he unlocked the supply cabinet for Mrs. Eleanor Brooks, straightened the reading tables, and greeted each person with the same calm smile. If he noticed that people looked at him differently now, he never showed it. Daniel Price certainly noticed. More inmates were asking Samuel for advice than for books. Some wanted help writing letters home. Others simply sat across from him for a few quiet minutes after lunch. Samuel never rushed anyone. He listened carefully, asked simple questions, and somehow left people feeling lighter than when they arrived. One afternoon, Marcus Hill folded the letter his daughter had sent and slipped it carefully into his pocket. I finally wrote back, he said. Samuel smiled. That took courage. Marcus looked surprised. It was only a letter. Samuel shook his head gently. The hardest steps are often the smallest ones. Daniel wrote the sentence into his notebook without saying a word. Across the room, Mrs. Brooks looked at the framed quote hanging above the shelves. The strongest leader is the one who helps others become strong. She smiled to herself because she knew the words described the old prisoner better than anyone else inside Blackwood. Outside, Tyler Kane sat alone on one of the benches in the yard. His friends had stopped making jokes about Samuel. In fact, several of them had started visiting the library themselves. Tyler watched Marcus walk past carrying another novel under his arm. You too, he asked. Marcus shrugged. There are worse ways to spend an afternoon. Tyler frowned. What is so special about him? Marcus thought for a moment. He makes you feel like you can become a better person. Tyler laughed quietly, but there was no humor behind it. Nobody can do that. Marcus looked back toward the library entrance. Maybe not, but somebody can help you believe you can. Tyler said nothing. The words stayed with him long after Marcus disappeared inside. Later that day, Frank Dawson found Samuel repairing a loose shelf near the back wall. Frank stood beside him for a moment without speaking. Finally, he said, I think I know who you were. Samuel continued tightening the screws with the small screwdriver Mrs. Brooks kept behind the desk. People spend too much time thinking about the past, he answered. Frank smiled slightly. Maybe, but some pasts matter. Samuel finished his work and stood up. Only if they help somebody today. Frank looked at him carefully. You spent your life teaching people, did you not? Samuel rested the screwdriver on the table. I spent many years trying to help others become stronger than they believed they could be. Frank nodded slowly. It was not a complete answer, but it was enough. He realized that Samuel had never hidden because he was ashamed. He had simply decided that who he was now mattered more than who he had been before. As evening approached, Mrs. Brooks asked everyone to help prepare the library for a small reading program she wanted to start. Daniel arranged the chairs while Marcus carried books to the front table. Even Frank helped straighten the shelves. Tyler happened to walk past the open door and stopped. He watched everyone working together. No one argued. No one complained. Samuel quietly adjusted one of the chairs and noticed Tyler standing outside. Would you like to help? He asked. Tyler looked surprised. After everything I said to you? Samuel smiled kindly. People can always choose a different path. Tyler stood there for several seconds. Daniel looked up from the books. Frank quietly waited. Mrs. Brooks smiled without saying anything. Finally, Tyler stepped inside and picked up a stack of chairs. No one mentioned the past. No one laughed. They simply worked together until the room was ready. When the last chair had been placed, Tyler looked around the library. It felt different from every other place inside Blackwood. He could not explain why. Samuel noticed the expression on his face. What are you thinking? Tyler lowered his eyes. I thought strength meant making people afraid of you. Samuel looked at the shelves filled with books and the people quietly working around them. Real strength gives people a reason to hope. The room became silent. Frank Dawson looked at the old prisoner and realized that the answer everyone had been searching for had never been hidden inside old newspapers or forgotten photographs. Samuel Brooks had been showing them the truth every single day. The strongest man in Blackwood was not the one who demanded respect. He was the one who quietly taught others how to find the best version of themselves. And little by little, even the people who had once laughed at him were beginning to understand. The reading program Mrs. Eleanor Brooks had planned for weeks finally opened on a quiet Thursday afternoon. Nobody expected many people to come. Libraries inside prisons were usually empty places where time moved slowly, but this one had changed. By the time the first hour arrived, almost every chair had been filled. Daniel Price looked around the room with surprise. Marcus Hill sat near the front with his latest novel resting on his lap. Frank Dawson stood quietly against the back wall. Even several correctional officers had stopped by for a few minutes before returning to their duties. The biggest surprise of all was Tyler Kane. He entered without saying a word and chose a chair near the doorway. Samuel Brooks noticed him but treated him exactly the same as everyone else. Mrs. Brooks smiled warmly as she stepped to the front of the room. Thank you all for coming, she said. I thought today we could simply talk about the stories that changed our lives. She looked toward Samuel. Would you like to begin? Samuel slowly stood. The room became completely silent. He looked around at the faces watching him and then rested his hands gently on the back of his chair. The most important story I ever learned, he said softly, did not come from a book. Daniel reached for his notebook. Marcus leaned forward. Even Tyler paid close attention. Samuel continued. It came from a man who told me that strength means very little if it belongs only to yourself. Real strength should leave the people around you better than you found them. The words settled over the room. Frank lowered his eyes because he remembered reading almost the same sentence in the old training paper hidden inside his notebook. Samuel did not explain where he had learned it. He simply sat back down. Mrs. Brooks invited everyone else to speak. Marcus was the first to stand. He held up the letter from his daughter. I spent years believing she would never forgive me, he said quietly. If I had never walked into this library, I probably would never have written back. He looked toward Samuel. Somebody reminded me that people deserve another chance. Daniel stood next. He opened the small notebook he had been carrying for weeks. Every page contained something Samuel had said. He smiled a little before speaking. I thought books were about escaping reality. Now I think they help people understand it. A few people laughed softly. Mrs. Brooks wiped away a tear. Then something happened that nobody expected. Tyler Kane slowly stood up from his chair. The entire room looked at him. For several seconds he said nothing. Finally, he looked towards Samuel. I spent a long time thinking strength meant making people afraid of you. He paused. I was wrong. The words were simple, but everyone understood how difficult they were to say. Tyler looked around the library. This place changed people without forcing them. I do not understand how that works, but I know it is real. Samuel gave him the same calm smile he had given everyone else. People change when they decide they are ready. Tyler slowly nodded and sat back down. Frank Dawson looked across the room and realized that the old prisoner had accomplished something that nobody inside Blackwood had ever thought possible. He had brought together people who normally never trusted one another. He had done it without arguments, without demands, and without ever asking for recognition. After the gathering ended, the inmates quietly helped return the chairs to their places. Marcus organized the books. Daniel cleaned the tables. Tyler picked up a box of supplies and carried it back to the storage room without being asked. Mrs. Brooks stood beside Samuel and watched the room empty. "You know," she said softly, "I think they all believe you are some kind of hero." Samuel looked at the shelves lined with old books and then toward the doorway where Tyler had just disappeared. "Heroes are ordinary people who decide to help when they have the chance," he answered. Frank happened to hear the words as he walked past. He smiled to himself because after everything he had discovered, he finally understood why Samuel never cared whether anyone learned about his past. The medals, the training grounds, the old photographs, and the forgotten newspaper stories were only small parts of his life. The person Samuel Brooks truly wanted people to remember was the quiet old man who sat in a prison library and showed everyone around him that kindness could be stronger than fear. And as Frank looked around the room one last time, he realized that the entire block had already fallen silent not because of what Samuel had once been, but because of the man he still chose to be every single day. The days that followed the reading gathering felt different inside Blackwood State Prison. Nothing about the walls had changed. The gates still opened and closed at the same hours. The count still happened every evening, and the old library was still filled with shelves that had seen better days. Yet everyone who walked through those doors understood that something important had happened. Samuel Brooks continued his quiet routine exactly as before. He arrived early, unlocked the supply cabinet for Mrs. Eleanor Brooks, straightened the tables, and carefully returned every book to its proper place. Daniel Price often wondered how someone who had changed so many lives could act as though he had done nothing special at all. One morning Daniel finally asked him, "Do you ever think about everything you have done here?" Samuel looked at the book in his hands before placing it on the shelf. "I think about the next person who walks through that door." Daniel smiled. "You never answer the easy way." Samuel smiled back. "The easy answers rarely help people grow." Marcus Hill entered the library carrying another letter from his daughter. This time his face was full of hope instead of worry. "She wants to visit when I get out," he said quietly. Samuel reached out and gently touched the edge of the envelope. "Then you have something wonderful waiting for you." Marcus looked around the room that had become his safe place. "I almost never came in here that first day." Samuel nodded. "Sometimes one small decision changes everything." Frank Dawson heard those words while fixing a loose window frame near the entrance. He paused and looked across the library. Weeks earlier, he had been trying to solve the mystery of who Samuel Brooks had once been. Now he realized the answer mattered less than he thought. The old photographs, the faded newspaper article, the forgotten military training paper, and the stories hidden inside the storage cabinet had all pointed toward a remarkable past. But the greatest proof of Samuel's character was happening right in front of him every day. People were changing. Daniel had found purpose. Marcus had found hope. Even Tyler Kane had become someone entirely different. That afternoon, Tyler quietly walked into the library carrying a small cardboard box. He placed it on the front desk beside Mrs. Brooks. "I found these in storage," he said. Inside were several old books with damaged covers. Mrs. Brooks smiled. "Thank you." Tyler looked toward Samuel. "I figured they deserved another chance." Samuel simply nodded, but Tyler understood the meaning behind that smile. Months ago, he would have laughed at the idea of repairing old books. Now he stayed after dinner helping Daniel organize the shelves. No one ever mentioned the old insults or the days when he believed fear was the same thing as strength. They belonged to another version of himself. As evening approached, Mrs. Brooks gathered everyone together one last time before closing. She looked around at the quiet library and then at the people standing inside it. "I have worked here for many years," she said softly, "and I used to believe books changed lives. Now I think people change lives." Her eyes rested on Samuel for only a moment. Samuel looked at the rows of shelves, the repaired tables, the framed quote above the reading area, and the small group of friends that had formed inside those walls. "Books help us remember," he answered. People help us become who we are meant to be. Nobody spoke after that. Frank looked around the room and realized why the entire block had slowly fallen silent around the old prisoner. It was never because Samuel had been stronger than everyone else or because he had once lived an extraordinary life. It was because he treated every person as though they still had value, even when they had forgotten it themselves. The final light in the library was turned off, and everyone slowly walked back toward the housing block together. Samuel was the last to leave. Before closing the door, he looked once more at the quiet room that had given so many people a new beginning. Then he gently switched off the final lamp, locked the door behind him, and walked into the evening beside the others, leaving behind a simple lesson that nobody inside Blackwood would ever forget: that real strength is not measured by the battles a person wins, but by the number of lives they quietly help rise beside them.